Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Soloway, and I'm here today to present my paper on an attack-centric viewpoint of the exploitation of commercial space and the steps that need to be taken by space operators to mitigate each stage of a cyber attack. So this is the overview of my talk today. First, we'll talk a little bit about the attacker profile, or the steps taken by an attacker to infiltrate an overall space system. The attack profile is the Lockheed Martin kill chain, and so that will be the reference for the attack portion. The attack profile will illuminate the need for monitoring architectures. And so we'll propose a enterprise tools that can be used, a monitoring architecture and enterprise tools that can be used to facilitate that architecture. We'll also talk about the unique needs of space systems and how to perform monitoring on those systems. We'll then talk about monitoring of the ground network, looking at hardware, software, and credential scanning to support ground monitoring. And then we'll also do a little bit of exploration of COTS tools for mobile and cloud monitoring and how those kind of integrate into this new data fusion center that we're proposing. Finally, we'll touch briefly on how important applying these monitoring tools to a space system, a space ecosystem or commercial space provider is important because being able to gain insight into your network to identify malicious actors is important. And sharing that information broadly across the community helps to strengthen the entire commercial space community. And in addition to that, having a robust monitoring network enables you to take signatures that are gained from others through the space ISAC and then being able to mitigate those effects on your networks before the attack is full blown. Then we'll wrap up with some conclusions and thoughts on future work for this topic. Okay, so on to the next slide, talking a little bit about the attacker profile. So there are several steps that an attacker takes in order to infiltrate a network, but the first one is reconnaissance. So what does reconnaissance mean? It is really, the key question is, how easy is it for the attacker to learn about your system? What is that information available on the public domain? Are there any other readily available data sources that the attacker can use, including investors or clients or subcontractors or supply chain that can allow the attacker to gain insight into your system? And this is important because an attack takes advantage of a vulnerability. So you can't have a cyber attack without having a vulnerability in your system that can be exploited by a piece of code. It takes time for attackers to identify the vulnerability and figure out how to deliver an exploit to take advantage of that vulnerability. So really protecting your information about your network, the tools, the software that you're using on your systems is really critical. Another thing that you can do beyond just protecting your information baseline is frequently update the system, patches, so not keeping your system static for a long period of time. This is because vulnerabilities are inherently part of any system. There's no such thing as a perfect piece of code, but the more time an attacker has to identify those vulnerabilities, the easier it is for them to find them and exploit your system. So having a system that changes over time keeps you one step ahead of the attacker. I understand that for space systems, or for satellites in particular, this is difficult because of the fact that software baselines for satellites typically remain fairly static because they are flight qualified and can be trusted to fly the vehicle. Typically, satellite operators are reticent to update their software baseline with patches for fear that it will somehow break the system. More rigorous software testing needs to occur on the ground to allow satellite operators to balance the trade-off between having a static baseline and the fact that the vulnerability in your system grows over time, is a function of time. So next step in an attack is weaponization. So when we're thinking about weaponization, as I mentioned previously, an attack consists of a vulnerability and an exploit. So once an attacker has, in this first step, recon, identified the vulnerability, they're going to develop an exploit to take advantage of that vulnerability. So what are the things that you can do as a satellite operator to prevent weaponization from occurring? One of the things that you can do is testing your software baseline. So there are tools that you can use to do software testing, both static and dynamic, that are available commercially. Static testing is where you have a tool that scans through your code and looks for poorly written code. That means that you're not actively using the software. It's more of a line-by-line text scan of the code to identify logic errors, for example. Dynamic testing is where the software is actually running on a computer and inputs are given to the software to cause fault states. So both of these types of testings are important for secure software development, and their software space systems operators should be aware of both of those types of testing tools and implement them where possible. One additional thing is that many satellite operators, commercial satellite operators, use open source software, and it's important to remember that these sources need to be vetted and tested. So there is a kind of community concept where an open source piece of software is being tested by everyone and is somehow more secure. However, space operators really do need to do their due diligence to ensure they're using a secure software baseline. So once the attacker has identified a vulnerability and they've developed an advantage of the vulnerability, you get to the delivery portion of the attack. And this is where they're going to either figure out if they can use fiber to network to enter into your system, or if they're going to use RF. So radio frequency is something that an attacker can use to enter into your system because of the fact that you're using antennas to speak to your vehicles that are in space. Another delivery method is USBs. I think most people are aware of this at this point, but USBs brought in from the outside and plugged into your network can bring with them exploits that can then find their way into the system. So again, monitoring is key. So in the figure here on this slide, you see a multi-tier concept. The first tier of a monitoring architecture, the bottom tier, is the assets. And so that's everything that you want to monitor. And for commercial satellite operators, we are now proposing that you want to include satellites, front-end processors, ground control networks, switches, servers, routers, mobile devices, and cloud devices, all as part of the assets that you're trying to monitor for your enterprise. And this is pretty different. A typical cybersecurity operations center, which is only monitoring PCs, for example, or PCs, servers, and routers, potentially maybe mobile and cloud. But I think the addition of satellites and that RF portion is new and something that is needed for the satellite community. So after the foundational level of assets, you get to sensors and tools. So sensors are what you deploy across your network to basically initiate scans and also monitor and scan network traffic. And we're also proposing that you deploy sensors to do RF monitoring and telemetry monitoring. So those sensors then are initiating the scans and then collecting information from the scans that they initiate. and they're feeding that information up to an integration layer. So this integration layer is a tool that typically resides in a cybersecurity operation center, typically in a logically separated network, using one-way diodes to collect all this information and correlate it, and then feed it up to a dashboard. So this is where you have a human looking at the data that's been collected and correlated by the integration layer. And that dashboard allows users to hunt for signatures of malicious actors that they've gotten from some type of threat data feed, or hashes of known bad malware. And hash, for those in the cyber community, is a unique identifier based on a piece of code that is mathematically digested into a unique hash identifier. And those can be searched for on the data traffic that is sent into this integration layer. The final layer that typically you don't see in a monitoring architecture is the space ISAC, or any kind of information sharing platform. So the space ISAC, in this case, because we're talking about commercial space, allows individuals to kind of subscribe to a threat data feed that they are getting from DHS, as well as other commercial vendors. And this is important because in the small space community, where there are a lot of shared technologies and components, being able to leverage threat signatures from others in the community can help to speed your identification of new threats to your system, and allowing you to kind of protect your assets from these attacks. So these are all the components that need to be part of your architecture, and we'll focus now on space systems, I believe, in the next slide. Yep. So here we go for spacecraft monitoring. So as I had mentioned in the previous slide, spacecraft are considered assets in the proposed space monitoring architecture. The space vehicle themselves are actually systems onto themselves. They're little tiny networks flying in space, typically using some kind of data bus, potentially 1553 or SpaceWire. That data bus connects many remote terminals. RTs are remote terminals, so I'm referencing the figure in the upper right-hand corner, but that remote terminal can provide a function such as thrusters or attitude thrusters, which would be part of an attitude control system, or a payload, imaging payload, or a sensor payload of some kind, or a communication payload. All of those would be talking with the flight software, which is accepting commands from the ground and also creating telemetry frames to send to the ground. One of the things we wanted to mention in this particular slide is that having a bus monitor capability on the vehicle itself would allow satellite operators to identify attacks on the data bus itself, which in most cases is unprotected. And we feel very strongly in this paper that adding a bus monitor capability is important, and having the bus monitor, allowing that bus monitor to provide a data to the ground in the telemetry is important to alert satellite operators to any anomalies on the vehicle itself. It's understood that having the entire bus monitor traffic being sent to the ground is unrealistic due to the limited bandwidth that a satellite has to send data to the ground, but even a flag of a potential anomaly on the vehicle would help to triage and potentially mitigate an attack or the effects of attack on a vehicle. Some of the other unique aspects of spacecraft monitoring is the intermittent communication with the ground. So in typical cybersecurity operations centers or typical IT monitoring for cyber attacks, it's a continuous data feed. Scans are regularly initiated, and scan results are quickly gathered from the assets on the network. However, if you have an asset that is only periodically able to receive a scan request or send scan information to the ground, this lack of visibility into the system can delay your ability to react to an attack. That's why I think looking at what this paper is proposing for follow-on work is creating APIs for telemetry monitoring into the integration layer that allow you to deal with this intermittent communication issue. So the question comes up when we're talking about these alerts on the vehicle and how to correlate them with potentially ground network anomalies. How does that correlation happen? While we believe that that's an area for future study, timestamps may be an easy first step to looking to correlate cyber events on the vehicle with cyber events on the ground to develop a cyber nexus for what's happening to the overall satellite ecosystem. So when it comes to ground network monitoring, this is pretty traditional for IT systems. And so we're just going to present a few tools that can be used to do the type of monitoring that you need for your system. Typically, what you would like to do when you're talking about your ground network monitoring is deploy an agent on every machine so that the scan can not only look at the traffic going in and out of the computers on your network, it can also dig further into the processes that are occurring on your computer and also doing credential management and credential monitoring on the endpoints. So as I said, when we're talking about assets, you want to do first hardware management. So that's knowing what is on the network. So you want to have tools that are regularly scanning your network for new hardware on the system. You also would like to be running software scans. Software scans, some COTS tools that exist are Forescout and IBM BigFix. These tools allow you to not only do software discovery, but also software configuration discovery. Both of those are important. Knowing what softwares on your network is important in order to know which vulnerabilities you need to patch for in your day-to-day operations. And then knowing the configuration is also important because having the latest version or having the patches applied to the proper version is an important piece of any enterprise monitoring capability. When you now have your endpoint monitoring established, you want all of that data going up into the integration layer. So when we're talking about the integration layer, you're thinking now about tools like Splunk or Elk, which have a database and API integration tools with things like Forescout and IBM BigFix, as well as other tools. These are just notional tools. We're not endorsing these tools in any way. It's just these are some common tools that are used in the industry. Those can, there are plugins with these tools and others to collect the data, be able to do some type of correlation or use third-party software to do correlation, and then push that data up to the visualization layer and also to databases, which can be stored for future use as far as looking at signatures in your system or identifying new signatures going forward. Also, syslog and red seal can be used for logging and for network monitoring on your system. So I wanted to talk on the next slide briefly about cloud and mobile. Surprisingly, mobile devices are now being used as part of the command and control network for satellite systems to the point where you could use a mobile device to command a satellite. So it's important to remember that, when you're dealing with mobile devices, you have to consider them as part of assets on your network. You want to ensure that in this case, similar to the IT devices, that you've installed some kind of agent on your system that is going to be doing monitoring. And on your sensor platform, You want to use things like Mobile Iron and Mass 360. Both of those tools are potentials or tools like them for monitoring your devices, and those have APIs that connect into the integration layer. As far as cloud services, Amazon AWS and Microsoft Azure both have cloud monitoring capabilities. It's just important to remember when you're using cloud, there are multi-tenancy issues as well as issues with shared vulnerabilities across the network. So when we're talking about multi-tenancy, with cloud, there are it's a virtual environment. There are virtual machines stood up for many different organizations. And while the base foundation cloud enterprise is secure, other tenants may not secure their compartments as well as others. While there are many cloud security tools that can deal with less secure compartments, it's important to remember that that is an issue and that you need to be able to come to some type of shared responsibility between yourself and the cloud provider in order to collect the data that you need to serve it, to provide the proper analysis, to provide your analysis tools the proper data to ensure that you're monitoring your network, your cloud assets in an appropriate manner. So in conclusion, what we've talked today about is the different stages of a cyber attack against a space ecosystem and how you can address the attack at every stage to either mitigate or prevent the attacker from moving further into your network. From a future work perspective, having API tools that allow new data feeds into your traditional cybersecurity operation is important, including telemetry and RF monitoring. And how commercial space operators deal with their networks is important. They need to consider kind of that later approach of identifying the assets, identifying the sensors that they need to deploy to collect the information at the perimeter for their system, how to integrate that data, what correlation tools they're going to use in order to provide a visualization for their operators to stay ahead of the attack and to have full situational awareness of what's going on, not only with their ground network, but with their satellite systems, and the robustness of coupling that entire monitoring ecosystem with the space ISAC that can provide you additional threat signatures that you can search for on your network using your monitoring tools, or also providing information that you found on your network to the larger community to strengthen the commercial space industry as a whole. Thank you very much for your time. My contact information is on the first slide. It's tsoloway@miter.org. Appreciate your comments and feedback, and have a wonderful day.